All right, thank you again for your patience. Welcome to the Great Books Mini Lectures. My name is Michael Carragher. My partner in crime, Maureen Fitzpatrick's not with us today, but together we sponsor this. We ask friends of ours to come and talk about books. It's not a bad gig. It's pretty fun. And we want to thank you and the CoLab staff, marketing, video services that help make this happen. And we're appreciative that you're here today. To begin, Kimberly Kuhns is Professor of American Sign Language and Chair of ASL Deaf Studies here at Johnson County Community College, where she has taught since 2009. Here at the college, she has served on the ADA committee. She has also been the co-advisor for the ASL Club. Prior to JCCC, she taught at Montclair State University in New Jersey, the University of South Florida, and Columbia College in Chicago. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in ASL from Gallaudet University, a private federally chartered university in Washington, D.C., specifically for the education of the deaf and hard of hearing. She also earned a Master of Arts degree in teaching ASL from the Teachers College at Columbia University in New York City. And she wanted me to specifically say, not the Columbia in Missouri. Outside the college, she has a strong relationship with the Kansas Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. She has been their chair for interpreting work group and a member of the pro bono work group. Kimberly enjoys attending many events at the Olathe Club for the Deaf. She is a season pass holder for the Casey Current since 2023. She also did the national anthem a couple of times at the Casey Current, and that may happen again this year. Kimberly is the biggest Penn State football fan and has been since childhood. She loves puzzles, photography, traveling, and animals. In fact, she once had a service dog named Moonlight, who often accompanied her to work here at JCCC. Moonlight quickly became part of her daily routine, and he absolutely loved visiting students in the classroom. Currently, her dog Beckett has been part of her family since 2016. Today's presentation covers Nyle DiMarco's 2022 book, Deaf Utopia, a memoir and a love letter to a way of life. About the book, Kimberly wrote, quote, "I selected Deaf Utopia because it offers an authentic insider perspective on deaf culture. Since it is written by a deaf author about deaf experiences, the narrator provides a culturally rich and firsthand account that cannot be replicated by outsiders. Also, DiMarco's story reflects my own. I came out in the 80s and learned to accept myself as a deaf LGBTQ+ person in a world that didn't always understand me. His book brings back those memories of finding pride, strength, and a place where all parts of who I am belong." Kimberly Kuhns.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about the technology and the issues we had, but everything will be fine. Okay. Yes, as Michael just said, I chose that book because it was written by a deaf person. It is about deafness, and it talks about Nile's family. And as we go through that book and talk not just about deaf folks, but I will tell you that in deaf culture, deaf folks might talk a lot and go off track a bit, but I'm going to try to really rein myself in for that. Now we have about 45 minutes to talk to you about everything I know about deaf culture would be impossible, but I will give you some tidbits, okay? And a little bit about the book. So why this book matters, and let me tell you a little bit about his family. There's a picture of his family. They are deaf, 7th generation deaf. There's a lot of discussion about ASL as a language, also about deaf identity. You'll notice in this picture to the left, the old identity with crayons that may have painted a person as a dummy if you were deaf, or as somebody who is a lip reader. Deaf and dumb would be another term. These are old terms that are not used today. We don't want them to be used today. Currently, we talk about a deaf person as someone who uses ASL, someone who's deaf, maybe hard of hearing, maybe late deafened. You see the colors on the left are pretty depressing, right? But the ones on the right are bright and prideful. Also, you see the flag on the right as a queer identity for Nyle. Here are the authors. Nyle DiMarco is on the left. We're talking a lot about him. On the right is a person whose name is Bobby. He is the author. He is also from a deaf family. His cousin is a friend of mine who now lives in California. He wrote the book with Nyle. Nyle told the stories that he wanted to say in American Sign Language, and Bobby translated those into English. All right, I want to make sure I've covered everything. Bobby did write, Robert Siebert, he wrote another book, so he's not just an author of one book. Here's more of Nyle's family. And if I may explain a little bit, I wish I could move, but they tell me I have to stay right here, so I won't really be able to point. But if you'll see on the far left is his mom, then you'll see Nico, Nico's the far left, and then his mom. Then Neil is the oldest brother, and then Nyle on the right. Seated is his grandparents. I'm going to have to move a bit. Both Nyle and Nico are actually twins, although they do not look the same. They are fraternal twins. The oldest brother is there in the middle. His name is Neil, and then the twins are younger. And the family was very close, not only because they are deaf, but also because of their Italian heritage. They kept close in all those generations. I want to tell you that 90% of deaf children, though, are born to parents who can hear. 90%. Of that 90%, 95% of those hearing parents do not learn sign language, which means all of those children are not exposed to language, to sign language. Perhaps those parents are looking at them and wanting them to speak, to be more oral. If they have deaf children, then and deaf parents, they're learning the language immediately, right? And so sometimes if you have a child who's deaf, you may come to JCCC and take ASL courses and learn the language here. Another bit about his family, and boy, the stories are rich. I thought I would pick one of the stories in there. They talk about the family going for a bike ride, okay? But that Nyle, whoa, he was a little bit ornery and adventurous and independent. And he took off one day, and they could not find him. But he wasn't worried, and he even found his way back home. But the entire family looked for him all day, and they got home, and there he was, waiting. And I thought to myself, I can really relate. I was the only deaf person, though, in my family. I went to a school without signing. I went to a school that was not designed for deaf folks. It was what we call mainstream, a public school. I was very close to my family. And then I would often be able to go to my Nana's house, right? My Nana would be out on the porch smoking, you know, and we would just watch. They'd drop me off and I'd hang out with her, right? And she would always talk to me, you know, how are you doing? She had a best friend by the name of Elsie. And the two of those ladies would sit outside on the porch, and I could do some voicing for myself, and then I would be like, well, it's time for me to go, and I would take off. And later, my Nana told me, she said, you know, Elsie, she told me, boy, your granddaughter is always on the move. She is going all the time. And Grandma said, I know, she is all the time. And Elsie said, there's nothing wrong with that, though. You would not want her to stay at home and be lonely. You wouldn't want that. You should be happy that she's independent. And my Nana was like, You know what? That is true. But it is not true for many deaf folks who stay at home, who are isolated, lonely. Maybe they have parents who are like, no, I don't want you to go anywhere. I want you to stay here. And feel that loss of freedom. I just want to go into a little bit of detail about Nyle's father. So he grew up mostly with his mom as a single mom. There's one story in the book that talks about when the mom first got pregnant, okay? Now, the father is also deaf, okay? When he was born, when Nyle was born, when the first baby was born, the father cried. And Nyle's mom said, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "Oh, he's going to be deaf. He's going to suffer like I did. He's going to struggle like I did." Because Nyle's father grew up in a family where he did not have language. He experienced that language deprivation, but they didn't sign. His mom grew up in a family that signed, and so Nyle's father looked at Nyle and was like, "Oh, he's going to have the same experience as me." But his mom convinced the father that, no, we will raise Nyle differently. We will raise the boys differently. Okay. Next slide. Nyle was involved in 2 different competitions. One was America's Top Model. I didn't watch a lot of that show beforehand, but once Nyle was involved, I sure did. The challenge he had with that was he was not able to have an interpreter all the time, right? You couldn't have an interpreter 24/7. So the language struggles for that. And I can't remember how many, I want to say, 20 models lived in this house. They could all hear. He did not have communication, but the few times he might have an interpreter, otherwise he was trying to use the phone to communicate with these folks. So it wasn't really a pleasant experience that he didn't really enjoy. He had to work extra hard for that communication piece. But he worked hard, he was successful every week. There was one week he talked about he had to do something, and they would get assignments. But there was no interpreter that day. And he was like, "I need an interpreter." It was like, you know how the photographer's there and it's modeling, right? And he's like, "Well, I can't hear. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. How do I know which way to move? What am I going to do?" It was a terrible struggle that he went through. He would have an interpreter just a few times, but he still learned how to navigate. And not only did he do that, he won the competition. Down below, you see someone who supported him greatly. There was one assignment with the parents, or with only his mom. I believe it was only with his mom. And that's where they saw the pictures. And Nyle said he was kind of worried because he's like, "I don't think my mom has any experience with something like that." But she did great. She was fabulous. And this is a beautiful picture of her. And indeed, he did win that competition. Now, I tell you that he didn't have an interpreter very often, and that is usually because of budget reasons. However, or at least that's what they said. But with Dancing with the Stars, when he was involved in that, he had an interpreter full-time and was able to be fully accessible to the language. But now Nyle is deaf, very deaf, no hearing. And Peta, the gal that worked with him, tried very hard, was very willing to work with him. They progressed each week until finally they won. I don't think our technology is working for me to show you the video, but I wanted to show you this video because in the past with Dancing with the Stars, each week they would have music. But one of the judges, Carrie, said, how is he doing this so well without being able to hear the music? You have to be able to hear the music in order to dance. And so one day they decided they would do a dance. It was a Spanish song. And they practiced, and they also had 4 of the like backup singers or singers that supported them. And so they had the sound on for the music. But during this particular part, the sound was turned off. No sound. And the dancing was perfect. All of them danced perfectly. And then the music came back on. All of the audience was shocked. Carrie looked at that and thought, wow, the judge, you can indeed dance without music. Now, there are some deaf folks that love music. They can hear the vibrations. But Nyle talked about, Peter, his collaborator, would sometimes have the music on really loud to practice, thinking that would help. But Nyle was like, no. I would prefer to not have any of this music. It messes me up when to start and get my count wrong. So they would often use cues so they would know which way. I could tell, like patting on the back and how to twirl. Like I could kind of see that if you're watching for it, you know when you're coming forward or which way. Most people would not see that. They would just overlook that. But those tips and cues were how they communicated on the dance floor. And it worked. They won. Now, he was actually the second deaf person. The first person to be involved in that show was Marlee Maitland. She did not win, but Nyle indeed won. Recently, we had Daniel Durant on there. He was the other one. He did pretty well. He got close, but he didn't finish. What was pretty cool with Daniel, his partner and he fell in love and are now married. She can hear, learn sign language, so it's kind of a nice romance story. That was the video, but it's not working. Sorry. You can Google it yourself, though, and check it out. I want to talk to you a little bit about the classroom and the education. You see the picture on the left? That's a typical classroom here, right? The chairs are aligned in a row. But if you're in an ASL classroom, it looks like this. We use classrooms. Often they do have the tables, but we always tell the students, you're going to have to move all the tables out. We need to be in a horseshoe, a semicircle. And then all the students have to move the classroom back and reset it, which is a lot of work for us. But the classroom on the left doesn't work for us because, of course, deaf folks are going to rely heavily on their eyes, right? And to be able to see the signing, right? If you all sit in vertical row in those horizontal rows, you're not going to be able to see anyone, right? And then if you do, as a deaf person, come into the classroom, you're often assigned a particular seat in the front. They always sit you in the front. Years later, my partner took a class here. And in that classroom, she preferred to sit in the back. And they were like, why are you sitting in the back? And she was like, I don't want to sit in the front. Then everybody's behind me. I don't know what's happening. What's going on behind me? I can't see everybody. Nope, no thank you. I will sit in the back. Even though the interpreter was up in the front and was like, you need to come sit up front. And she was like, no, I'll sit in the back where I can see everything. I want to see everything. I don't want everybody behind me. And it was like, oh, I looked back and I thought, I wish I would have done that. That is a good idea. Oh, back to the book, to add one thing. Most of these chapters have interspersed information about deaf history, give you some background information about the culture. So there's more information in each chapter. I know one chapter talked about Gallaudet and Laurent Claire, Thomas Gallaudet and Laurent Claire, how ASL came to be here in America. So that information is there. They'll also talk about something that we talk about in class called the Milan Conference and something called oralism, which is using voice and not being able to use sign. And that was when they really wanted to try to get rid of ASL. But there's some pieces of history interspersed throughout the chapters in that book. Now, Nyle grew up in New York with his family. He went to the New York School for the Deaf, New York City. And back then, I would say the time period was probably the late 80s or early 90s for him. And they used a lot of what we call SIMCOM, simultaneous communication. So that means that you're trying to talk and sign at the same time, which I will tell you is not effective. Okay? It's not. Because if you are doing this SIMCOMing and signing and speaking at the same time, if I'm deaf and I'm trying to use SIMCOMing, I will drop some of the English in favor of the signing. But if it's someone who can hear, who speaks normally, right, they tend to drop the signs in favor of the spoken English. So it is not effective because you can't fully represent both languages. Now, back then at his school, they required Nyle to wear hearing aids, and he hated them. His mom was like, I know, but you still have to. And it was the whole system, right? And it wasn't until later when the family moved to Texas for a better educational system there in Texas, near Austin. For 1 year, they did put Nyle in a mainstream public school, and he hated it. He told his mom he wanted to quit, but mom said, we are not quitters. We don't quit. Stay for the year. So he suffered through that year. But part of the reason, next slide I think shows it, he talked about for the first time he had interpreters. See, this is what a classroom might look like, right? See how busy the background is? So much going on. And see where the deaf person is trying to watch maybe the PowerPoint, the overhead, the whiteboard, the interpreter, the teacher. There's so much going on, rather than have direct communication and direct education. And to be frank, most deaf folks hate it as well. Now, from my background, I will tell you that I also went to a public school, what we would call a mainstream school. I did not have an interpreter, and it was such a challenge for me to try to read lips for the teacher and try to keep up. Now, it wasn't until later that I went to the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, NTID. I took a class. It was a class for auditing. They had an interpreter there, and the interpreter was right there, okay? But I didn't look at the interpreter because my habit was to watch the teacher. I wasn't used to watching an interpreter and a teacher and divide my attention between the two of them. Imagine you all, some of you are in ASL class right now, right? And you're learning a new language and you're trying to watch and to take an hour or two of using your eyes to take in the language. It's exhausting, right? Can you imagine a deaf person watching an interpreter all day long with their eyes, feeling like you can't blink or look away, you can't look down to write any notes or take notes? I would often have a note taker in class, but still trying to watch, trying to look down, trying to follow everything that was happening. So when I went to Gallaudet University, all of the teachers signed. I felt like I could relax. I could just watch what was happening. I could have interactions with the teacher. It was great. Back to education. Teachers often expect deaf students to hear, to have some kind of hearing. And that is not true, okay? Do not expect that. Deaf folks are taking their information in visually. Those who sign from a young age, once they have language, can pick up other languages much easier. But their language is visual. There are 3 deaf professors here. You'll notice Ron Szymanski, Stephen Barrios, they're all here. But not one of the 3 of us have the same background or are like the same. I grew up in the East in a mainstream school. I went to college, a deaf college, for a brief time. Ron Szymanski grew up going to a school for the deaf. You have a deaf sister, right, Ron? So deaf in his family. Stephen grew up mainstream. Didn't have an interpreter, did you? And what's ironic, Stephen may be labeled hard of hearing, but his identity is deaf. His major was actually in music when he went to college, but now that's out the window and he's focused on teaching American Sign Language here. So everyone is different. Don't expect all deaf folks to be exactly the same. We also have a hard of hearing person in the audience. Each one of us are different. Please don't stereotype us because we are not the same. Ooh, let's go back to talking about reading lips. So we don't have the same experience about reading lips, right? Now, sometimes trying to read lips can have a different experience to that. Trying to read, it's hard because people speak differently. I remember one story that always sticks with me when I was young, okay? My mom leaned down to me and said, and I learned growing up, I was always speaking, right? And she said, pizza's coming, right? When I looked at her lips, it looked like she said to me, Bit, bringing pizza. Right? Every Friday we would typically have pizza. And I was like, Bit is coming. So I had a diary, okay? So I was always writing, and I wrote Bit, B-I-T. So this person stopped by. They brought the pizza. They were like, come on in. I was like, the pizza delivery's coming in? I was like, why is the pizza delivery guy coming in? And I realized that the two of them were dating. My mom was dating this guy, and it wasn't until much later that I realized his name was Pete. This whole time. I was like, I don't understand, but yes. So do not count on lip reading. Oh, how's my timing? Many words look the same on the lips, so don't count on that being clearly understood. Nyle did go to Gallaudet. He was focused on becoming a math teacher until life took him in a different direction, acting, dancing, modeling, and that career took off, and so he did not continue to be a teacher. So let's talk about language oppression. Many times people say, can deaf people read? Even now people are like, can deaf people drive? Seriously? And let me tell you, honestly, a higher percentage of deaf people drive better than hearing people. Yes, and I'll tell you why. Hearing people have the music cranked up, they're listening to music, they're not paying attention. Deaf people are paying attention to what's happening. And I'll tell you, we see a lot more, our peripheral vision is a lot wider. Trust me, if you were to go out and put earplugs in, and drive home, you would see so much more than you missed on your way home yesterday. Now there's a word here called audism. We hear many isms, racism, sexism, etc. Audism means to put a priority on auditory hearing. There are deaf people who use their speech. But many hearing people want them to become like a hearing person. And many hearing people tell their deaf children, we'll tell you later. We'll tell you later. Deaf children might be like, what did you say? Why are they laughing? Why is everybody laughing? I grew up and experienced some of that where they told me, wait a minute, I'll tell you later. Now, it's a different story now, but my family now tells me everything. They keep me informed. I have one sister who signs pretty well, another who can do some more finger spelling, and they definitely keep me in the loop now. But back in the 60s when I grew up, people didn't know. Comparing myself to Nile's family, wow, such a language-rich environment where everybody signed. He had access to communication and language full-time all the way. We certainly had different experiences. Now there is a video about autism, and that is in the library if you want to check that out. This picture here showing the chains on the wrist will tell you a little bit about history for deaf folks who are not allowed to sign. They were not allowed to sign at all. If they did, they were often smacked on the hand with a ruler. That is part of their history. Maybe you might ask me, does that still happen today? And I'll tell you that there are places where it still happens. There are some places out there. Yes. Nyle also made the point here that we want to respect the linguistic right of deaf folks. ASL is a language. That's my language. And I grew up using my voice. I could speak. I could perhaps talk to someone. But here's what happens. If I were to use my voice, I have to think about how I want to say the word. But if I sign, I don't have to think at all. I can just express myself. It's my natural language. So for him to have come from a deaf family, I look at that and think, how nice was that? Language was passed on. Your history, your culture, support, everything. Thank you. So talking about a deaf identity. Like I said, I grew up oral, and it wasn't until I was 10 that I learned some signs. I look about Nyle and I think he had access he learned from since he was a baby. I didn't get exposure to sign language until I was about 10 years old. And I didn't really find my identity as a deaf person until I was 30. 30. And I also came out of the closet as a gay person later, in the 80s. I was in my 20s when I came out. And funnily enough, I came out as gay first and as deaf later. You would think it might have been the different. I finally, in 30s, when I took a class back in Minnesota and I had a deaf teacher, did I find my identity as a deaf person? Did I finally get it? I am deaf as well. And again, that wasn't until I was in my 30s. Often deaf folks pass on stories, right, about what happened. In Nyle's family, he told stories, as I'm sure stories get told in families who can hear. And I know Ron Szymanski has told me some stories, told me jokes, and I'm just fascinated listening and thinking that he got exposed to that from the deaf school growing up. But growing up in a public school was much different. But yes, the stories make your growing up, your family life very rich. Let's see the next one. Oh, one more thing about coming out. I came out in the 80s. Back then it was pretty hard to do. That was also a time of AIDS. It was a difficult time. But my family was very supportive, very accepting of me. I'm so blessed for that. Nyle talked about some struggles he had. Yes, his family was deaf. They were very close. But the expectation was still that he would marry a woman. So he struggled some with that, and he came out later. Next slide, yeah. So activism. Nyle is very supportive, much of an active participant in supporting deaf people in media, in acting, producing. He has done so much. You'll see top left shows some different actors there. You can take a look at them. Maybe you saw the movie Eternal, the Marvel movie. The black woman there to the right was in the movie Eternal. Troy Koster on the left was in the movie Coda, and he won the award, the Academy Award for that movie. Down in the left, let me ask, did anyone watch the Super Bowl halftime show? Hands up, anybody? So let me tell you just a little bit about the halftime show for us. Way back in the day, Marlee Maitland was on the same stage with Garth Brooks, the performer. Side by side, shared the stage. But now it's completely separate. So me, as a deaf person, I'm trying to watch the TV, I'm trying to watch the performance, but I have to have my laptop set up. Just lately we had it on Apple TV so I could see the interpreter. And it looked like that, it was separate. But how nice for all of you who can just watch one screen and see everything. More work for us, once again, to have access to the communication. We are seeing more and more interpreted movies. You'll see there is Barbie, has the movie there with the interpreter there on the side. So not just captioned, but an interpreter. And we are thrilled to see more and more movies showing that. All right, next, go ahead, next slide. Just some other movies that you may have seen or heard of. Nyle produced 2, Deaf U and Deaf President Now. They're on the left. He has produced both of those. Deaf U, I'll give you a little hint. Ron's son is in that movie. Now, recently, the movie Deaf President Now came out, so that is very new. Oh, Nyle also had some to do with this about a Maryland student at the Maryland School for the Deaf for Audible. And I'm sure you've heard of Switched at Birth. And there are so many more out there. Go ahead, next slide. Some pictures. This is just me personally, right? I did meet Nyle. And here's his mom. I met her 2 years ago there in Florida. Oh, she is such a cool woman. Loved her. And here's Nico up at the top. Now, we used to have something called the Student Kansas Association of Interpreters. It was a club before. Now that has changed to ASL Club. But I was one of the sponsors, and we had Nico come as a DJ, and he did that for prom. I started to say homecoming, but it was prom that he did that. And then we hosted it at the Olathe Club for the Deaf, and Nico was there for the public could come. And here is one of my children over here. Both of my children are featured here with Nico. So thank you so much for coming. One of them are here today. So my daughter. So this is just me personally and my connection. Okay, the book. Yes, next. Here's some more books in case you're interested. There's many books out there for you to read. This is a recent one that is also at the library now. This is talking about the School for the Deaf in Riverside that won many football games and their quest for glory to win the championship. Down at the bottom, Haben is a deaf-blind woman who wrote that book, Haben. And many more are out there. But this book, wow, to have Nyle come from a deaf family, who his identity as a deaf man and also queer, it just encompasses everything. I could talk more and more, but I'm going to cut myself off. So I wouldn't do the cut myself off at my lips. I will do that with my hands, and I am ready to turn this over. Thank you. And thank you.
We have time for a few questions, and we're going to ask that we do kind of a delicate dance here with the microphone. I'll pass it to you, ask your question, I'll take it back, and then pass it to the interpreter. It's not ideal, but it's what we have right now. Are there any questions?
Okay, so you're all taking ASL class, so you don't have any questions, right? You already know a lot about it. Yes, somebody in the back.
Yes, thank you, Kimberly. I actually read the book in anticipation of your talk and learned so much. I was especially interested to learn about the history of deaf education and is it the Milan conference? So that was, as in my role at JCCC, that was so interesting for me to learn about. I didn't know a lot of that. I wonder, at 10 years old, was the first time you encountered sign language. And what did that feel like? Did it feel, I'm just trying to imagine what that would be like to suddenly have language at that age.
Okay. I think Jamie will answer that. And I did forget to add part of that. Yes, you're right. I did grow up speaking using what we call oralism, but I also watched my dad read the newspaper. And I was probably around 7 years old when I also started reading the newspaper. And I think he modeled that, and I think that's part of why I had some exposure to language. But right, when I was 10, I remember the first time I saw somebody use their hands for language at camp. I remember seeing them sign tree, and I was like, what? Well, I get that. And I started picking up the language more and more after that. It was like the light bulb went out, or went on. I understood. But that's why you think about children who grow up without any language, why they're behind in language. But I think it helped because I watched my dad read the newspaper and I read the newspaper. I love reading the newspaper. I grew up doing that since I was 7, but I doubt that's happening so much now.
Hi, thank you so much for letting us in a little bit more, the deaf community. My question is for people who are hard of hearing, is that typically an official diagnosis, or is that something that they personally decide to identify on their own time?
Interesting question. Well, it depends on their level of hearing loss, usually. There's an audio test that you can take. There's like an audiogram is what they call it, where they're testing your hearing to see how much. You go to an audiologist and they'll tell whether or not, according to that you are profoundly deaf, or if you're hard of hearing. That can also be part of it. But please don't ever ask a deaf person, how much hearing loss do you have? Please, it is extremely annoying. I have 95% hearing loss. But I don't ever say that. It's not a part of me. I'm deaf. I do have some hard of hearing friends who prefer to be identified as deaf. They don't want to be referred to as hard of hearing. Yes, you? Somebody's got that? Okay, good.
I noticed in your presentation that you talked about like using oralism and then being exposed to American Sign Language when you were, what, 10? How exactly, I still don't follow, like, how that works.
Sure. So I grew up going to speech therapy, which I hated. I had to practice trying to make my mouth to make those sounds, practice making sounds again and again and again. Please remember that not all deaf people can use their voice. They can't. It so happened that I could. I am not a perfect speaker by any means, but I'll tell you one negative thing. Well, whether or not you go to a public school or go to a deaf school, but when you go in as a student to speech therapy, most of those speech therapists tend to be like, oh, good job, good job. They're quite the cheerleader. But please, as a speech therapist, please don't lie. Please tell the truth. Because some are like, oh yeah, I can speak. They told me I could speak. I go to McDonald's and I try to use my voice and they act like they can't understand me. So as a speech therapist, if you know anybody, if you're thinking about it, please be honest, okay? Some deaf people can speak and some can't. It's just the difference in people. Yes, did you have a question back there?
Okay. Hi. My question would be that some other countries incorporate learning languages very early on in their schools. How do you think America should start doing that to make, well, their country more inclusive, especially to their own people? ASL is still, you know, a language for us, so how should they start doing that?
Ha! Well, the system is controlled by people who can hear. And they think, oh, I know what's best for deaf people. And they don't. It's the system that needs to change. We need more deaf people involved with the system. But right now there are barriers to that. But that's the only way it'll change. And parents typically listen to doctors, medical professionals, who tell them what needs to happen That's the system. Often doctors are looking at having procedures done like a cochlear implant, and sometimes that is also supported by getting money, the profit. Sure, yeah.
As students, what do you think we should be able to do as someone who's hearing to be more inclusive to the deaf community?
Be a good ally. Go to deaf events. Please, when you go, try not to, like if you see a deaf person at the store, please, you don't need to go up and go, I can interpret for you. Here, I can sign a little bit. We do just fine. We really don't need your help shopping, but thank you. But no, it's important too that you watch your attitude, that you have a good attitude. If you have a good attitude, we are happy to work with you, happy to support you, and would equally enjoy having you as an ally. Yes, did you have a question back there?
When you're talking about movies and film, I was just wondering, what is there like a consensus on ways that films and commercials can be more inclusive for deaf people?
Interesting question. We do have ASL films in the library, right around there, in the resource center. So I would suggest first, go take a look at that. There are hearing movies, but these films are focused, right, on the hands and the face. But if you look at other films, let's say, like the hands are cut off, like the signing, you don't see all of the signing, right? But when deaf folks make movies about deaf people or with deaf people, you see everything. So I don't know how we could tell all of these hearing people that they need to change their way or change their movies, if that's what you mean. Yeah, no. But I will tell you, like in CODA, we saw everything. You know, often in movies, like you don't get to see the full language, but you definitely did in CODA. Oh, and in Deaf Out Loud you did. But sometimes, you know, hearing is the majority, right? Majority culture, and they tend to be the ones making decisions.
Kimberly, thank you. And thank you all. Appreciate it. We'll see you next time.
Thank you all. Thank you.